Hello, everyone. We hope you are doing well. We are very excited to be joining you. Sorry, I was just double checking about the stream. Very excited to be joining you with the platform YA Book Club for another month. We have with us Jennifer Lynn Barnes, the author of The Inheritance Games, which is right here. Which was a book that we were reading last month, actually, but we had to awkwardly miss one because of unforeseen extreme weather circumstances, which is not something that we've had to go through before, but I'm very glad that Jennifer's able to join us today instead. So for those of you who are like, the book club, I've never heard of the book club before, what are you talking about? The YA book club at Penguin Platform is something that we do every month. We read a different YA book together, and then on the last Tuesday of the month come together for a live stream. So if you want to get involved, we've left all of the information down in the description, including a really fun Discord community where a load of readers, writers, young people are discussing books, and it's a good time. We also are using the hashtag platform YA Book Club, got it right, in order to discuss on social, and so you can ask questions in advance. So I have a document here which has a ton of questions from you guys and from readers, as well as some questions of my own. But if you would like to ask Jennifer any questions at any point during the stream, please put it in the live chat, and a lovely colleague of mine is going to be putting it into a document that I have in front of me so that I am able to ask Jennifer all of your questions. So the way this live stream works is, for the first section, we are going to be discussing the book, writing, life, and then we will have a little section at the end for spoilers. So if you have not finished the book yet, do not fret, you can watch the beginning, and then I will make it very clear when the spoiler chat is happening, and we will go on to spoilers instead. So with all of that said, let's get into the questions. Hello, Jennifer, how's it going? How are you?
Oh, it's good. I'm so glad to be here with you all. Sorry about the previous weather problems. There was an ice storm. I lost power for 3 days, but it's back on now.
Extremely dramatic. You know what? And a great excuse to have missed the live stream, to be fair. So let's ask a question from some readers first, because I think this is a great question to start with. This actually got asked by both Levi and Charlotte Breaker 97, who asks, how did you come up with the idea for the book? Because the plot and everything is so impressive. Like, where did that even come from?
Okay, so the book came in sort of 3 parts. The first part I actually had, which I had for years and years and years, was Hawthorne House. So back when I was in university, the year I graduated from undergrad, my dad retired, and then he spent like 5 years designing and building and working with architects and a crew and everything, his and my mom's dream house. And he asked me and my brother, do you have any requests for the house? And I said, I would like a secret passage. That was my only request. Nothing about bathrooms or bedrooms or anything. It's just like secret passage. And he actually, in their library, there's a button you can push and a bookshelf disappears into a wall. And it's just amazing. And I remember the first time I walked into the house, my dad helped design like every little molding on every wall and every cabinet. Like, he just spent tons of time drawing things out and working with artisans and all of that. So the first time I walked into the house, I thought, oh my gosh, I can feel him in this house. And of course, I'm a writer with a morbid imagination. So I thought, oh, someday he's going to be gone and it's going to kill me to step into this house, because this house like is my dad. And then my writer brain started thinking about the fictional version of that, which of course is that, but a million times more. So instead of one secret passageway, there are dozens, if not hundreds, right? Instead of the house taking 5 years to build, it took 50 years. Instead of being a relatively normal house, it's this huge mansion with puzzles and codes and riddles. You know, the old man didn't just build himself into the house with his preferences like my dad did, but like he actually built parts of himself and codes and messages into the house. So I would have been about 22 when I first thought about that. And then it was 12 years later that I finally found the right premise for the book. So
Mm.
for years, I had been pitching puzzle house books to my publishers, and I'd be like, okay, all these kids pass out and they wake up and they're in this giant puzzle house. And they'd be like, it doesn't really sound. So then I was trying to come up with ideas for characters' backstories, and I had a brainstorming plot or a brainstorming question that's based on the psychology of fiction. So one reason we might like fiction is because we evolved to like gossip. So like in gossip's what they call an evolutionary adaptation, because it might have conveyed benefits in the environment in which we evolved, evolutionary psychology. And fiction's gossip about people who just happen to be make-believe. So this theory predicts that the same things that you would be like, oh my gosh, if it happened to someone you knew, are the things that you would read about in a tabloid if a tabloid was covering it, or a magazine. And those are the same things that we'd be interested in books, right? So it's just this kind of thing. So I said, okay, well, based on that, I'm going to come up with ideas. And the prompt I was using was, what could happen to a perfectly ordinary person that would be so ready for gossip that they could become the most famous person in the world overnight, and without ever having tried to become famous. So I was coming up with all the things that could happen. And most of them were like really awful things. Like, what makes you front page news if you're a normal person? It's like, there's a plane crash and everyone dies but you. Or, you know, you escape from a serial killer. So I was coming up with all these things. And then I eventually came up with a billionaire dies and leaves you his entire fortune. I thought, oh, that's not morbid. That's fun. And then it was a day or two later and I thought, oh my gosh, and you have to go live in his puzzle house. And so I finally got to write my puzzle house book. So I had the world of sort of Hawthorne House. I knew it was going to be a book with lots of puzzles and riddles and codes. I knew that the mystery at the core of the book by the premise was going to be that Avery had no idea why this billionaire left her his fortune. And then the plot came last. So then I kind of decided the characters, and then I always come up with plots using what I call the 3 mysteries technique, which is, I always say I don't write mystery books, I write mysteries plural. So there are always like 3 big mystery questions. And so in the inheritance games, the big one is, why did Tobias Hawthorne leave his fortune to Avery? The second one is, what happened years ago, or what happened a year before the book starts, to sort of drive a wedge in between Jameson and Grayson Hawthorne. And then there's a third question that I can address in the spoilery part that has more to do with danger and peril. And so then I had the 3 questions, and then I came up with the answers. And that's all I knew when I sold the book. Like, here are the questions, here are the answers. And then after I sold the book, I went and actually built the puzzle sequence in the book, like this puzzle, this puzzle, this puzzle. And then I started writing. So it was a lot of different stages of idea development before I ever wrote a chapter of the book.
I guess an interesting question. This is actually a question from another reader. Becca asks, how much did you plan before you start writing? And I guess also, like, I'm kind of interested with your other books. Do you tend to have a very similar relationship with all your books when you start writing? Do you like always love to plan everything out? Do you, different books kind of call to you in different ways in terms of technique? Like, how does that work?
So when I first started writing books, the many years ago, I knew nothing. I knew the character's first name, and if they had a superpower, I knew what the superpower was, and then I made up everything as I went along. Over time, I've started plotting more and more, but I don't really consider myself a plotter so much as a thinker. So I know a lot about the book. I know, like I said, I know the questions, I know the answers. I don't usually know how the characters get from the questions to the answers. And all the little developments along the way are surprising. With inheritance games, I did figure out the like actual puzzle sequence. So I spent one day and just did this clue leads to this clue leads to this clue leads to this clue leads to the answer. But what I don't plan and what I really can't plan is the way that all the subplots, which are always about relationships, are going to develop. So who has chemistry with who, what complications arise, all the little mini twists that happen at the end of the chapters, those are usually surprises to me. So I have like this big picture. I know where I'm going, and I might know, like, if I'm writing a book about serial killers, I know who the killer is. And I might know, like, these are the 3 bodies that are going to show up, and these are the clues to who the killer is. but all of the, or I might know this is the puzzle and then this is that, but all of the actual character interactions that form sort of the fun parts of the books and all the little twists along the way where every chapter is kind of like a commercial break, all of those come about organically. So I've got big picture, but I don't figure out the details. The details kind of figure out themselves.
Amazing. So just another thing to point out again to the people who are watching, just in case you weren't here right at the beginning, don't forget you can ask your own questions in the chat. If anything that Jennifer is saying like sparks some questions within you, or you remember something that you thought about while you were reading the book, then go ahead and put them in the live chat. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to ask you around your like work as like, you are a professor, like you do the smart people stuff with the science, but specifically the kind of psychological, like science side of fiction, right? Like that's your speciality. So how, like, tell me a little bit about that. How did that does that come into your writing, the way that you think about what readers might get from what you're writing as you're writing it? How does that work for you?
Sure. So I started off, so I wrote my first book when I was a teenager, and at the same time, I was majoring in cognitive science in college. And I started off, and they were two totally separate things. Like I was doing my research on how monkeys understand the minds of other monkeys and things like that. And then I eventually went to grad school and I got a PhD. Meanwhile, I'd sold my first 5 or 6 books and was writing, and I had these two totally separate lives. But the nice thing about going into sort of research psychology, where you're, making observations, asking questions, designing experiments to test the answers and developing theories, is that there's a psychology of pretty much everything. So if there are people involved, there's psychology involved. So a couple of years into grad school, I really, one of my professors said, it's kind of weird you do that book thing. Maybe you should study the psychology of books so it's less weird. And I was like, oh, that sounds fascinating. And so then my two lives that had started so separate started kind of converging on each other. And so I'm now an associate professor at the University of Oklahoma, and I have a lab where in a normal semester I would have 20 undergrads and 3 grad students, a postdoc, a whole kind of little group of people running all of these experiments about why we like stories, the kinds of stories we like, what fiction can do to you. So how it can affect attitudes towards marginalized groups, or what we learn from fiction. And I also study the psychology of fandom. So I study things like cosplay and fan fiction, and sort of where that's situated along a spectrum of how all readers engage with fiction and the role of imagination. We also study things like daydreaming, basically anything that has to do with fiction or the imagination. My lab is kind of all over it, and I have the coolest job because I get to come up with theories and questions and test them. And probably about 5 years ago, I started being asked to give talks at writing conferences where it was basically like, oh, this is what writers should know about the psychology of fiction. And so I did a lot of work pulling together all of the existing research and theory from like a dozen different disciplines, because some of it's psychology, some of it's communication, some of it's evolutionary biology, some of it's philosophy, right? So I'd go through all of this and I picked out what are all the different theories that people have about why we like stories. And then the purpose of the theory is it allows you to sort of organize a bunch of ideas in this cohesive way, but it also allows you to make predictions. So then I started saying, okay, if I have all these theories about why people like stories, what predictions do those make about the specific kinds of stories that people would like? And that is largely where inheritance games came from. Like I told you all the different pieces of how I got the different ideas. But again, the reason that I was asking myself what could make you famous overnight is because one of the theories of fiction is this, it's a byproduct of evolving to like gossip. Right. And then there are other theories of fiction. So like another one is that we like fiction just because authors cram it full of things that we are hardwired to like. So you just co-opt a bunch of other preferences. And so I've done a lot of work on like, what are those other preferences? And they're things like wealth and beauty, competition, safe danger, because the danger in a book can't hurt you, touch, so I go through and do all these pleasures. And you'll notice 2 of them that I said were wealth and competition. And so that's where the title Inheritance Games came from, because games is a competition word and inheritance is sort of this wealth resources word. So Inheritance Games is actually the title wealth competition. So it was like very consciously designed to do all of that. And then like within the book, I'd go and I take all these theories and I apply them not just to like the premise of the book, but like the character development of each of the individual characters. So like different characters will have words associated with them that trigger these different parts of the theory. So like in the Inheritance Games, Jameson is the competition character.
Yeah.
So anytime Jameson's in a scene, he is talking about games and challenges and winners. He's the one that's going to be associated with things like bets and risk taking and all of this kind of stuff. So I knew he was my competition character. Grayson is actually written as a danger character and kind of like a psychological dominance character. So if you look at the like actual words that are used to describe Grayson, it'll actually be like at the level of adjectives to get whatever that is. Like Rebecca was the beauty character. And so you kind of go through, and those are just two of the theories of fiction, but there's like 7. And then I also have all my work on the psychology of fandom. And that stuff basically says, what does every big fandom enabling book, movie, or television show have in common? And so there I've done a lot of developing of the theories myself. And I sort of have these checklists about, okay, you're going to have like these 8 things in all of these properties, and that's what they all have in common. And then I go over on the writing side of thing, and I'm like, well, I want to make sure that I have these 8 things. A lot of it comes in revision. So the first draft, I'll have the story and I just write it. But with Inheritance Games, actually the first revision I did on my own, because my editor was really backed up with other books. And I said, well, why don't you let me take a pass on it on my own? And I fixed some things like pacing and characterization and stuff. But I also just took a specific psychology pass on it, where I went through every chapter and was like, how can I use human psychology to make this chapter more like compulsively readable, and so that your brain has to just like grab onto it and not let go, and like what will make it the most fun essentially was the goal, was to just really up the fun. So I went through and I did that every chapter, every character, everything. So I don't think, I've written another series called The Naturals that actually is about using psychology to fight crime. And I think it's very obvious to people with that book how my PhD in psychology comes in common. But there's actually more psychology in the Inheritance Games than any of my other books. It's just kind of invisible psychology.
Well, like speaking of, so like the idea of going through and having these scenes that really grab people, kind of have this element to them, like we on the Discord will start reading, and then we'll like post our initial thoughts about like what we're thinking about it. And I literally read that first chapter, like the introduction to Avery, and I was like, oh wow, like this is the most punchy, like badass introduction of this character. Like you get so much about her to begin with. Do you see kind of big punchy scenes like that when you're thinking about it, that you're like, oh, this is what I'm going to include in there? Or do you go from more the point of view of this is what I want to get across, and I've got to try and figure out what that looks like in terms of like the scene and how it might break down?
So during the first draft, I'm not always strategic about it, but that scene with Avery was so hard won, because that was a revision scene. So a very common problem for me in the first draft of my books is that the supporting characters come across really strongly, but that the protagonist doesn't yet. So I usually don't really know who my protagonist is in my first draft. And I really had to figure out for Avery, that was one of the big things I had to figure out in revision. And so one of the questions I asked myself, I did kind of have to take this step back, and I was like, well, she's really good at solving these puzzles and riddles and games. So like, what made her that way? And I'm a developmental psychologist by training. So I like to go back to childhood and be like, okay, so what was her early childhood like? Why, like, how did she become this person who could go into Tobias Hawthorne's mansion and go into this game with these boys who were raised to play the game and hold her own with them?
Yeah.
And I think that was something in the first draft. One of my agents read it and she said, it's great, but like, how is she as good as they are at all this stuff when they've been practicing this their entire life? So then I had to go back and sort of big picture design Avery's childhood. And at first it was little things like, okay, you know, her mom turned everything into a game. And so she's always playing games and she's very competitive. And then it was, okay, I want to show she's really good at strategy and games up front. So I'm going to have her play chess in the park. So that wasn't in the first draft at all. That was a second draft.
I'm not saying anything because of spoilers, but we can talk a little bit more about that chess element
and the spoiler was also a second draft thing. That wasn't in the first draft either, because that only came in after I showed her there. And like, I wanted her, I think I did have the principal thinking she was cheating in the first one. But I rewrote kind of like she didn't like her interest in actuarial science and like all the little details I had to rework after I kind of knew who she had to be to do what she does in the book. I then went back and made her that person in the beginning. But when I first sat down to write the book, I probably did the first 10 pages. I probably spent more time on than any other part of the book. So people are always like, was the puzzle sequence hard? And I'm like, the puzzle sequence was easy. Like finding a way to, in a very short number of pages, introduce you to Avery and Avery's life and get right into the action. Because Grayson shows up on like page 12 or 10. So I had 10 to 12 pages, and I think it's 5 scenes. So they were very short scenes to show you like a 360-degree view of Avery's life before she jumps in to sort of the insanity of the book. So those pages I spent more time on than anything, and I probably revised them, I kid you not, 100 times.
I love them. I was upset. Literally, my messages at the beginning of the book to everyone was just like, "Ah, my God, I love her." We've had some questions in the chat actually around the stuff that you've just spoken about. So Elle wants to know, I think this is to do with when you were talking about like the beauty character, the dominant character. What does Xander, Nash, and Avery symbolize? Do they have similar kind of symbols behind them?
So they did not have like the other things I was talking about were what we call pleasure triggers. So they didn't have a specific pleasure trigger associated with them. But I do like Nash. To me, another way that I develop characters is I use, so there's things that people find universally appealing. And that's like, we're hardwired to care about hierarchy and dominance and danger and competition. These are things that like, it benefits us as a species to care about, because if you don't care about danger, then you might walk off a cliff, right? So there's kind of intention getting things. But there are also things that might, instead of appealing to absolutely everyone on kind of a base brain level, there are also things that are known as like idiosyncratic pleasures. So those might be things that they're not universally appealing, but that you really, really love them. So for Nash and Xander, I did both of them very much based on what I call my id list. So the id in Freud's theory was the part of the psyche that wants what it wants when it wants it, because it wants it, darn it. So it's not logical, it's not rational, it's not bound by rules, it just wants certain things. So I have this list called my id list. It's 7 pages typed. It's got subsections. It's got hundreds and hundreds of entries. And it's just like every trope I love. So it's like any character trope, any plot trope, a lot of its locations. Like I love stuff in secret passages and rooftops and waterfalls and helicopters and like hotels. And I just have this long list. So oftentimes when I'm starting with a character, I will get a variety of things from my id list that I like, and then I cram them all together. And then I try and figure out how, for example, I can get someone who's like an overprotective big brother and a cowboy and rides a motorcycle. And you put it all together. And then the developmental psychologist in me then goes, okay, how did they become this person? And I go back to childhood and like build up how they became that person. And that'll sometimes tell me something new about them that I add into kind of the character model. And I go back and forth like that. So that's where Nash came from. I love an older protective big brother, like Dean Winchester style
Mhm.
on Supernatural,
Yeah.
or a bunch of the like Elijah on the Vampire Diaries, or like many different forms. I always love the kind of overprotective big brother character. I'd never written a cowboy kind of feel before, and I was like, I love the like the person who, like, I think in book 2 I say something about how like the whole house could crash down around him and Nash wouldn't even bat an eye. Like he would probably tip his cowboy hat to death himself. I loved the idea of someone like the trope of the person who doesn't really, who comes from a super wealthy family but doesn't really want the money. So all of those, I just like went through the list and I stacked them all with Nash, and I figured out kind of who he was. And then I knew I wanted him to be a potential love interest for Libby. And so he was going to be older. So then I kind of had to figure out like, okay, what was happening for the years before Jameson, Grayson, and Xander
Mhm.
came around. Xander, I knew I wanted to be kind of like my, I knew he was going to be the smartest
Mhm.
of the brothers because he's like brilliant. I knew he was the one who kind of had the old man's mind in the way that like Xander sees things in more than 3 dimensions. And like it doesn't make sense to anyone else, but it's all very complicated and moving pieces and all of that to him. On my ed list, I had characters who love pie. Which again goes back to like it's random things. I'd be like, so I will write down like I love characters who like pie, and
But
in
like that
Xander's
makes
case,
sense
that
because
it became scones.
you're stacking them up, but like having the background of psychology, like you know why those things are happening. It's not just like here is a character that's just a load of things put together. It's like no,
Right.
these
So
things
it's like
all.
you figure out you figure out the 3 or 4 traits you want them to have. So I was like, Xander is going to be like extremely like optimistic and extremely brilliant, and he's going to seem really happy on the surface, and his mind's kind of like the Rube Goldberg machines, because Rube Goldberg machines are on my id list and I love when those are included. And he likes, you guys call them scones, right, instead of
Yeah,
scones?
I mean it's contentious.
either,
Either way
either
works.
and he loves baked goods, so like sometimes it's cookies, sometimes and so I had all of these kinds of things. And then I also figure out, by that point I knew he was the youngest brother. And like birth order can be really psychologically informative, and you kind of fill these different niches, and he already had these older brothers who had their niches. So I actually did Xander last because I knew the world he'd been born into and who his older brothers were. And like most of the others have this penchant to be a little too dark and broody. Like definitely Grayson's dark and broody, but Jameson has his, he tries to take nothing serious, but he's also kind of dark and broody. Like Nash isn't as dark, but he's kind of a little more, he takes things casually, but he's overprotective. He does have that undertone of danger too. So I thought, Xander being born into this world, younger siblings tend to do what's called niche filling, which you find the open niche or niche, however you want to pronounce it, and you fill that. So oftentimes we define ourselves in contrast to our siblings. And if older siblings already have staked a claim on an activity or a personality trait or a temperamental thing, sometimes younger siblings will end up with what's left over. How they can be themselves. So Xander was really developed in large part in contrast to the rest of them. And then there are other things, like I spent a lot of time with Xander thinking like he's, none of them know who their fathers are, but he's the only one who is not white. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about like how that interacts with Xander's experience, because his experience growing up Hawthorne would have been very different. And so I think a lot about what are called characteristic adaptations, which is the idea that we sort of adapt to the challenges of the environment that we're in childhood, and then those become like embedded parts of our personality. So it's like, what are kind of the survival mechanisms? And in Xander's case, it's what are the survival mechanisms growing up as the youngest Hawthorne in these particular circumstances, and how with these particular brothers and this mother and that grandfather. So he was determined a lot by what I knew about the world he'd been born into. And then of course the fun thing and knowing how like smart he was. And then the fun thing was figuring out how that manifests in the present in a way that he's I hate to play favorites, but Xander is my favorite Hawthorne. He's the most he's the most fun to write of all of them.
We had a couple of people actually ask about favorite characters, so I'm glad that you've managed to get that in there. We have a question from Hitchhiker Hobbit, who is one of the old favorites on this on the chat. Hello, welcome back again. Who wants to know, studying the psychology of fan fiction, that sounds amazing. Is there anything you can recommend to read on the subject?
There's not much on the subject because a lot of what's been written on the subject has been written by me. I can say that there's lots of cool research coming. So there are lots of like amazing up and coming researchers who are like graduate students who are doing a little more on this. I can tell you, I've written a couple different theoretical articles on fan fiction. There's some neat research, and the names of the researchers are escaping me, but there's some neat research basically comparing the ways that fan fiction looks different from fiction. And it's really interesting if you view it in the context of the psychology of fiction more broadly, because oftentimes fan fiction is everything that psychology says we should like in fiction, with everything else just written out. It's like in regular books, there's all this stuff that by convention we have in the books. But if you go over to fan fiction, it's like the emotions and the focus on emotions and relationships, which is a lot of what drives us to fiction to begin with. You know, so much fan fiction is focused solely on emotions, solely on relationships, and kind of dialed up to 10. There's also some neat work, kind of suggestive work, and it's a way we're going in lab currently. We're looking at the parallels between daydreaming about fictional characters as maybe an activity that bears a lot of resemblance to at least people's initial writings of fan fiction. So the way some people come to fan fiction is they've been daydreaming the stories in their head forever of like, they get to meet these characters, or they, you know, the characters do this, that, and the other. And then one day you discover other people are actually out there writing this stuff down, and there are people reading it, and it's amazing. So we're actually starting to study in my lab the phenomenon of daydreaming about fictional characters, and how that may or may not look like fan fiction. And if it's a broader sort of scheme of activity, like what percentage of people do it, and what do those daydreams look like? Because usually when I ask my lab, you know, do you daydream about fictional characters? Half of the people are like, all the time. Like that's like mostly what my daydreams are about. And the other half of the people look at us really strangely and they say, why would you ever do that? And they've like never had a daydream about meeting a fictional character or interacting with the world or anything in their lives. And so people who do it seem to do it a lot, and other people just don't do it. So we're looking at why that is and what the psychological benefits of doing some of these things might be. There's a lot of work on what's called parasocial relationships, which are one-sided relationships we form with fictional characters and celebrities. So basically anyone you don't actually know, who you come to know only by consuming media about the person. And our brains kind of trick us into thinking that these are two-sided relationships, because in the course of human evolution, if you saw someone all the time or were thinking about them a lot, like interacting with them in whatever way, it was because you knew them. Like I would never see someone once a week for 10 years the way you do with a favorite TV show, maybe, if you didn't actually know them. So you start to act like you know them, and it has many of the psychological benefits of a two-sided relationship. So I'm really interested also in sort of the role that fan fiction and other fan activities play in strengthening and maintaining these relationships, because normally they're seen as completely one-sided, so you never actually get to interact with that person or come that close to them or actually know them. But when people are writing fan fiction about a fictional character, they do get inside that person's head. They get to determine what they do. You know, if you're writing any kind of character who's kind of an avatar for yourself or self-insertion character, you get to interact with that character. And then there's things like, role playing different characters as games people will do. So there's all kinds of fandom activities that look like they may have the effect of really strengthening these relationships that we form with fictional characters, even though we know people outside of fandom form these relationships as well.
So interestingly, for anyone who is watching, we have a video up already with Naomi Novik about fan fiction and how it can affect and improve your writing by kind of practicing with fan fiction. And we also have a video coming up, which I'm going to say the writer of the new Critical Role book behind the scenes, who is going to be talking a little bit about role play and writing and how that works. So perfect example from Jennifer here about why those things are kind of relevant and related together. So we have a question from, apologies about pronunciation, I'm not entirely sure whether it's Sierra or Kira's Corner. How do you keep in touch with the experiences of young people as an adult? If you're writing, for young people, how does that work for you? Are you checking out social media and TikTok side of things? Are you speaking to young people? How does that work?
This is something I'm really just now confronting, because when I first started writing YA, I was 19. So the first book I sold was the 7th book I wrote. I wrote it the summer I was 19. I ended up selling my first book a few days before my 21st birthday. So at the time I was writing what I knew. So I never up front had to figure out how am I going to figure out about how the young people think, because I was a young person. And then for the longest time after that, I was in grad school, because with a PhD you're in school for a really long time. So even during that period of my life, it kind of feels like it's an extended adolescence. I remember there was this line on Grey's Anatomy years ago where they said that intern year was like high school with scalpels. And I was like, yeah, grad school, it's like high school with data. Not the bad parts of high school, just the good parts of high school. But you haven't really started, to me, I didn't feel like an adult because I was still in school. I didn't have, sort of a permanent location. I didn't know where I was going to be or what I was going to do. And I was taking classes, and it's kind of this moratorium period before you actually have to figure out how to grown up. So for me, that went till I was 28 or 29. And then I was like, okay, now moratorium period's over and I have to figure out how to adult a little more. And so for that time, I was really strongly related to YA. The majority of what I read was YA. The majority of what I watched and liked was YA. And then the only time it became sort of the thing that made me be like, oh my gosh, I'm not a teen anymore. And there's some disconnect here is when I have 2 young kids and I'm expecting a third. And then suddenly I was I'd watch the teen shows and be like, oh my gosh, I'm the adult. That person's closer in age to me than the other one. It's kind of a really rude wake up, because I'd been writing YA since I was a YA. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, I'm much older now.
I'm just
and I would occasionally be watching teen television. I'd be like, what are you doing? Think about your future. And I'd be like, oh no, what is happening to me? So I still, most of the media I consume is still tends towards the young adult side of me. When I watch adult shows, I think, oh, this needs more teenagers. I do think my YAs have gotten older. So I used to write more about 15-year-olds and sort of the early side of YA. And now most of my characters are kind of 17, 18. And they're often characters who've grown up kind of quickly, like Avery is 17, but she has essentially been forced to live a little more like an adult for sometimes. I teach college, so I interact on a daily basis with sometimes hundreds of college freshmen and sophomores. So they're 19, 20, so still on the older age range of that. But I basically live on a college campus. So when we go out to take walks, we go to campus. And, my kids are basically growing up on a campus. I teach undergraduate classes in both writing and psychology. So that gives me a lot of interaction with at least the older, right after high school. And usually when I'm writing that protagonist now, it's kind of like that 17, 18-year-old. And so I am interacting with a lot of real 17 and 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds pretty consistently. And then also kind of through the media. But I think a large part of it too is, so there's this concept that's kind of about like how much psychological continuity you feel with your past self.
Mm.
So there's some research that suggests we view our past and future self sort of as different people than us. Like if you look at brain imaging studies, your past self, your future self, you treat them like they're someone else. So that's why presumably like sometimes you'll agree to do something 6 months from now, and then 6 months from now you're like, why did I agree to that? It's because you're agreeing for someone else to do that, and that's future you, and past you is the same way. But I also think there's sort of an individual difference variable where some of us still feel like we are the same person, like we feel a strong sense of continuity with that past self. And I think sometimes it's this strong sense of continuity and identification with your younger self at potential time periods. So I still feel like I've got my inner 17-year-old, and my experiences were totally different than, so like there was no social media, there was no, like I was growing up in a different world. But I think some people have the tendency when they get to be adults to develop like teenage amnesia, where they can no longer imagine what it's like to be a teenager. And I feel like I remember that so vividly. And I think that what that gives you is, it gives you that teenagers are people.
Yeah.
And that they have no more in common with every other teenager than you have in common with every other like 36-year-old.
Yeah.
Right. So they are individuals, and they are complex, and like they are just as smart and capable and interesting and dynamic and diverse as any other people. So I feel like that also, it's not like I'm ever like, I need to do an anthropological study of the 17-year-old, because yes, there are differences, and I want to stay in tune with the current experience, but you also want to write stuff that's kind of in some ways timeless, that someone can come in 5 years from now and it's not so about the current experience that they can't still get it. And I think that comes maybe a little more from the universals, and that there's something very universal about recognizing how complicated and three-dimensional every person is, and that being 17 doesn't make you any less complicated, capable, or three-dimensional than you're going to be 3 years from then, even though society says those are very different.
Just everyone who's watching, just a reminder, because we're about to go into spoiler territory in a couple of questions time, put your questions in the chat. We would love to answer some more of them. Okay, so before we get into spoiler territory, we've had a couple of questions. So this one, for example, from 20-something, if your book was made into a film, who would you want to play the different characters? Well, excitingly, The Inheritance Games has been offered as a TV show. So what can you say about that? Can you say anything about that? What's going on there?
So The Inheritance Games is in development with Amazon as a TV show with Sony and Osprey Productions. I can't tell you most of our extremely classified top secret things, but I can tell you we have a wonderful writer attached. Grania Godfrey has done a lot of work in the DC television shows with like The Flash and Legends of Tomorrow. So she is working on developing a pilot script and plans for season 1 and beyond. We are nowhere near talking about casting or anything like that yet. And I don't actually have anyone specific in mind for any of these. It's interesting. One of my colleagues in psychology has recently become really interested in something called aphantasia, which is basically individuals who don't have visual images in their heads. And we were talking about this, and I was like, what do you mean have a visual image in your head? And I don't. Like if I get anything, it's like I may not be clinically aphantasic, but I'm very, very close. So you like say picture an ocean, and I think of an ocean, but it doesn't have any visual qualities. And the same thing actually goes for my characters. So it's not like I have a very strong visual image of what Avery looks like. I have to remind myself, like I have a little note over to the side about what everyone looks like. Mm-hmm. And sometimes when I'm writing those scenes, I'll be like, I have to go back and read the first Grayson scene to remember what Grayson looks like, because I can't make pictures of people in my head. And I honestly have close to no idea what Avery looks like, because at least with the others, she sees them a lot. So I'm used to the way she thinks about them. And so I have kind of vibes in my head, if not a distinct visual image. But Avery doesn't look in the mirror all that much. Yeah. So like, there's like one description where she gets a makeover and I'm like, okay, so she has brown hair. But like beyond that, I have no idea whatsoever what Avery looks like. So I think for me, casting is very much about the vibe of the person, not so much the kind of look of the person. So I feel like I have no idea if I'll even get to be involved in casting, but if I was, I could tell you whether or not someone feels like Nash or feels like Jameson or feels like Xander. But I don't actually have like a celebrity or anyone in mind for any of those things.
That's so interesting. Okay, right. We've only got about 15 minutes left, so we are going to go into spoiler territory. The first spoiler question we had was from a reader, Pippin, another one of our like longtime book club members. Hello. And the question is simply, sequel ? Exclamation mark, which I put in the spoiler section because yeah, the end of the book is it's so ready to go. Like there's threads unfrayed. They're going in different directions. I want to know everything, but I have a feeling it's going to be in a sequel.
Yes, there is a sequel. The sequel is done. I have first pass pages in my inbox right now, which means it's like typeset and everything, and I'm just reading through it for final typos. So your sequel will answer all of your questions that you have at the end of book 1. I am not promising that you won't have more new questions at the end of book 2, but any questions you have at book 1, you are going to get the answers to in book 2.
Oh my God, I have so many. I also just seen in the chat, which I maybe should have clocked, that Hitchhiking Hobbit and Pippin are the same person with different usernames. I should have, the Pippin Hobbit reference I should have gotten. Same person on asking questions on different platforms. Did you have, when you were going through, because like you were saying about there being different mysteries, because you've got like the mystery of what's going on with why Avery in particular was picked, the little mini mysteries of figuring out what the numbers mean and all the different clues they go through, the mystery also of like her memory and her dreams and like what is she remembering? Is she making it up? Like, is she just like why all of these things kind of come up, and then every time she has a theory that becomes almost another mystery. So the theory of like, oh, what happened at my birth becomes a mystery that could go nowhere. It could be a red herring, you don't know, like all this kind of stuff. Did you have in your head for each of the mysteries before you began like what the conclusion would be? So the mystery of like who shot at Avery, you were like, oh yeah, it's going to be Skye, and that's, I already knew that, or were there possibilities of it being someone else at any point?
So the 3 big mysteries, which were like, why did he choose Avery? Mm-hmm. And I mean that in the like, where does the puzzle sequence lead?
Yeah.
So that one I knew. What happened with Jameson, Grayson, and Emily was mystery 2, and then mystery 3 is who is trying to kill her. And I knew the answers to all 3 of those going in. What I do is I audition answers. So like I come up with all the possible answers I think it could be, and then I decide which one I like the best. But oftentimes the things that I considered but decided no on will be red herrings, or those will be theories that someone has as they go along. So I'll come up with what my answers are, but I also have a list of like, well, what would the logical thing for Avery to think be? Like, what are her different theories at the different times? So I knew those 3 big things. A lot of the other things, so there were some things that came in revision. And they came in revision in part because when I revised, the first version of the book was completely self-contained. Mm-hmm. And when I revised, I started getting ideas for how this could be a bigger story and what mysteries may still be out there. So when I did the first revision, I decided to write it like it was the bigger story. And then if my editor told me I needed to scale it back, I could go back to that original version. So things like that I Have a Secret game Avery played with her mom and what that secret was. Things like Harry, who she plays chess with in the park, none of that was in the first draft at all. So that wasn't in the ending at the very end, like after she solves the puzzle sequence, the twist after that wasn't in the first draft at all. So that came about when I basically let myself say, what if there's something kind of bigger going on here? But other than that very beginning and very end thing, the rest of it, I knew the answers from pretty early on.
That was just this, like, there's this moment in the book when it's like right at the end and you're like, okay, yep, reach for Jameson's hand, squeeze hard, I'm sure. Oh, it's the acknowledgements. No, it's the epilogue. And suddenly we're in Xander's point of view. And oh God, there's more things going to be happening. Were you ever tempted when you were writing to have any of the other characters' point of view come into it? Or was it very much like it's Avery's story and the reader only having her point of view added to that mystery element, I guess, and that kind of stuff?
So book one, I always wanted to stick with Avery's point of view because so much of the mystery is things that if you went into the other people's points of view, they would know, right? Because she doesn't know who to trust. So if I'd written other points of view, I would have had to write them in a kind of vague enough way that I wasn't tipping the hand about whether they could be trusted or not. So I really wanted the reader to experience Hawthorne House with Avery, as in you, the reader, and Avery are the outsiders here, and you're trying to figure everyone out. When I wrote that Xander epilogue, I thought in book two, I want to have lots of points of view. And I thought that because writing book one was so hard because there are all these different relationship dynamics. And when I was writing book one, I'm like, oh, I wish I could do a scene that's just Jameson and Grayson, right? Or I wish I could do a scene that's all four brothers. Or I wish I could do like Rebecca and Thea. Like I was trying, or Libby and Nash. And so there are all these relationship subplots. Like there's this whole thing where it's like, Libby and Nash and Elisa's his ex-fiance. And like, so there's a lot happening off page. And I thought I'll end book one with the Xander epilogue. And then in book two, it'll be mostly Avery, but I'll have everyone else's points of view scattered throughout. So that's how I wrote the first draft of book two. And then my editors came back and they're like, we're not sure the other points of view are working. So you could try this or that or the other. And I looked at it and I realized that it really was sapping the book of a lot of tension. So I'd done it to make it easier for myself. But then I ended up undoing it. So there are a lot of scenes that were originally in the sequel told from Grayson's point of view or Jameson's point of view. And those scenes are still in book one, but I had to rework them from Avery's point of view. And then I have a bunch of other scenes that are from other people's points of view that you actually like don't get in the books, but I may be saving for extra content.
I was just going to ask, like, is there anything that you didn't get to include that you'd kind of written that you're like, oh God, I really want me to be able to show that to someone because it feels like it's like particularly.
There were a lot of really fun scenes of just the brothers. So either just Grayson and Jameson or Grayson, Jameson and Xander that you get hints at in the book now, but you're not actually there for the moment of the scene. That I will probably save and show to someone someday because I think they are fun. They just didn't belong in another book that was very Avery driven and about that mystery.
Because I think obviously with Avery, her being such an outsider means that even if she's in a room with two of the brothers, they're not going to be having the same conversation that they would be having if it was just them alone. So yeah, and everything, I totally get what you mean, like, because everything has to be from the point of view of an outsider looking in on something, and unless she's kind of sneaking and eavesdropping, it's going to be what they will say or admit in front of her. But that kind of works because, like, obviously the ending with Xander, it relies on her kind of like being more concerned with the other three brothers for various reasons, either because of like Nash and Libby and like being a bit like, what are you doing with my sister? Or these two guys that she has like potential feelings for. Xander, almost just from her own bias, she's not investigating him or trying to work out what's going on with him, because she's like,
of course he was playing her the entire time.
I love that reveal. That was so
Xander,
great.
I originally I was like, so I knew Xander would have a strong arc in book 2, and like I knew I wanted him, you know, because in some ways this is his puzzle as much as it's Avery's now. He was like, everyone else got theirs and it's mine now. But now she's trying to figure out what he's doing, and the reader is also trying to figure out what he's doing and what he knows.
Oh, we've had another question from the chat. How do you figure out the plot chain for a mystery? Like with this book, how did you make sure the chain of clues made sense and came and kind of like joined up with each other? How did you come up with them?
So I did that separate from any other plotting of the book. So I kind of made myself Tobias Hawthorne because he had to design this puzzle sequence, right? And so I started, and it was easier in book 1. There's also a puzzle sequence in book 2. It was harder to write because I'd already used a lot of my go-to puzzles in book 1. So I just sat down with a notebook and I brainstormed all the different places he could have hidden clues. And how they might lead from one to another and what the different riddles could be. And then it just kind of took form where I'm like, okay, well, he left them letters. The letter's the first clue. And I wrote it down in a document. It was like clue 1, and I'd say what it was, and then I'd write how they solved the puzzle leads to clue 2. And so I had like a 9 or 10 step puzzle sequence that was written out. And I think of all of them, I think all but one. There was one that I ended up changing a little because it didn't quite work when I wrote it. But other than that, all the puzzles stayed as they were. So then for book 2, I kind of did the same thing where I had to think of new puzzles because I'd already used some of my go-to versions of it to design that sequence again.
Amazing. We've probably got time for like one more question. You know what? We're going to do the classic. Is there a question that you don't get asked about this book that you wish you would get asked, or like something that you were like, this was more significant than people seem to think, or like this is something I want to talk about the process or anything like that?
I mean, I think if I want to talk about something, it works its way in as the answer to a different question too. So I think I've mostly gotten to talk about most of the significant things in this book. I think one of the things I maybe don't talk about quite as much is that, so I mentioned the things that big fandom enabling properties seem to have in common. And one of them is that they tend to be, so 2 of them that are kind of tied together. One is that they tend to be multi-generational. So they're about either families, like children and parents, or teachers and students, or multiple generations of something. And another one is that they tend to be what I call temporally expansive, which means that they extend most often into the past in a significant way. So you've got like Vampire Diaries always had the like long flashback scenes, right? And Supernatural has now and then, and you can go through, and it's actually very common for most things that have big fandoms. Even you look at something like Grey's Anatomy, and like so much of that story is about what happened when in the early seasons is about Meredith's mom and Richard Weber and all of those kinds of things. So when I do kind of my 3 mysteries, one of the mysteries always has to do with something that happened in the past. And book 1, that's Emily. But of course, I knew going into book 2 that it was going to be something very different. And if you've read book 1, you can probably guess based on the ending and some other things what that is. So one thing you're going to get in book 2 that I'm really excited about is this is really a multi-generational mystery. So it's not just about what happened now, but it's about what happened years and years ago. And so in a certain sense, like when I'm figuring this out, like I need to know what all of the characters were like when they were teenagers. From Tobias Hawthorne, his children, the children, Nash. So like I kind of know all of these different things about them. And one of the challenges is figuring out sort of how to bring that past into the present, which is something that I think is very fun in book 2.
Ooh, looking forward to it. So that's, I mean, we've reached the end of the live stream. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for joining. Absolutely flew by. If you guys haven't, I mean, everyone who's reached the end at this point will have read the book, but check out some of Jennifer's other books. I think you mentioned a few in the stream. Very excited to kind of read through some more of your stuff that I haven't already. Just to mention, for people who are kind of interested in what's happening next with the book club, we have the last Tuesday of the month is when we normally do live streams. So the last Tuesday of this month of November, we are going to be talking to Manjeet Mann, who's written Run Rebel, which is our book for November, which is an amazing novel in verse, which we've not done on the book club before. So we're very excited about that. So yeah, join us at the end of this month for our interview Q&A live stream with Manjeet. You can ask questions on the Discord as always, or in the live stream, or using #platform YA Book Club on any of your social medias. So yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer, for joining, and everyone in the chat as well.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.